Do you think Britain can do anything on her own?
No. No, nobody can. It's just like Europe. I mean, that was the whole fallacy of those who wanted us not to go into Europe. Look what we've suffered. If we'd gone into the beginning, we could have created it, we could have shaped it, we would have made it into the organization we wanted. No, of course not. How can a country of 60 million people have the... In the 19th century, it had at least great empire. It had the Indian army, it had colonies, it had power. But we haven't power of that kind.
The president of the Carlton Club will address us on Civilisation Under Threat. The Right Honourable Harold Macmillan.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, at my extreme old age, I find myself in a curious dilemma. From time to time, people write and ask me to do something, usually a long time ahead. One possible reply is to say, yes, I'd like to come, but I shall probably be dead. A more difficult answer is to say, I'd love to come, but that week, 7 months ahead, I shall probably have a bad cold. On this occasion, I could have made either of them. They would have been almost true. But 4 weeks ago, I had a very serious attack of pneumonia. And now I have a bad cold. And yet I have to speak. When you ask for a title for an address, it's very hard to think of one. I thought perhaps it is the 150th anniversary of the foundation of the Carlton Club, perhaps to speak of the history of politics since those years. But that would be well known to everybody, rather banal and perhaps trite. Or one can take subjects nearer to modern politics. But that for me is dangerous ground, on which I have to tread very delicately. And so I thought something very vague and meaningless and a little pompous would be about right. When we speak of civilization, I don't think we always quite realize, especially when we speak of this Western civilization in which we are now living, how short and fragile has been the history of civilized man on Earth. We all know we find our minds almost overwhelmed by the immense periods since creation, the vast areas of space into which we travel, without, as far as I can see, much advantage to anybody, or send up rockets who only come back with the information of interest to specialists. But we know, and we can hardly imagine it because it's so long, millions and millions and millions of years. And to us it means little. Even this Earth, this little, tiny, fragile piece thrown off, so they now tell us, by some explosion or other. Even its life is terribly long. Even the life of, beginning of life on Earth. The fish, the birds, the animals, and so forth. I read the other day that the ichthyosaurus and the other one, as we call it. Rome lived they did for about 2 million years. They roamed about the valley of the Thames, happily, not knowing that in due course they would give way to dons and undergraduates. But no doubt if anybody had talked to them about the crisis or menace of their civilization at any period in these 2 million years, it would have been thought to be rather bad taste. But they ended. Anything that would be called man is perhaps what they tell us now. 200,000 years old, not more, 300,000 perhaps. Something called men who got together into some little clans perhaps for hunting purposes or defense, but nothing more. And in Professor Arnold Toynbee's great book, which is, with all the criticisms that have been made against it, is still the most marvelous, in my view, a marvelous picture of the history of civilization. He tells us, and we know, that in this vast area of time, civilization has existed for what? 10, perhaps 12,000 years. They've come and gone. Some mysteriously arisen, like those cities in Guatemala, and then some unknown reason come to an end. Reached a very high degree of civilization, organization, the building of temples and buildings and roads, and then ended. Others have passed on, some to their successors. But what we are interested in is what I would call the European civilization, or the Western civilization, which has lasted from perhaps beginning of Greek thought and Greek effort in Ionia, in Greece proper, in the islands, its literature, its art, its philosophy. And then the organization of the whole into the Roman Empire, which lasted, after all, we write cheerfully. I thought, even sometimes think Gibbon rather offensively about decline and fall. At any rate, it lasted much longer than many of our powers may last. But it lasted until the 4th century, and in the Eastern Empire until the middle of the 15th century. And although the Asia was lost, Asia Minor, North Africa, still there remained the great tradition of the Roman Empire. And when it fell, or was overwhelmed by the invasion of massive tribes seeking somewhere to live, moving for reasons we hardly know how to explain across the great Euro-Asian plain, it fell under a weight which it could not resist. But it fell gradually. Many it absorbed. Many had been Romanized or Hellenized. And when the official end, as it were, of the empire came, the settlers had already been, for some years, some centuries, some decades even, affected by the great tradition of Greco-Roman civilization, upon which everything that we enjoy ultimately springs. At the same time, another immense force came to us in the spread of Christianity. And that civilizing power, which was the second great reason why, even after the fall of the imperial system as such, the traditions of Europe were maintained, sometimes through dark ages and difficult times, but by the great power of the church, the missionary, the monk, the priest. And so we pass on all its ups and downs, all its strange changes, with still a theme below it all. Into the age of faith, the 12th century, and so far as the Reformation has left them untouched, we still see probably the most beautiful things, buildings, and certainly the most beautiful glass that has ever been made by men in the great cathedrals and priories and abbeys of the world. In the ensuing period, as I read it, there were always two forces at work, one centrifugal and one centripetal. One, the attempt to set up small states or authorities, to which the feudal system gave great help when the great feudal nobles, nominally under the authority of the king, in fact became independent powers. The other, centrifugal. And with the rise of nationality, we move into the period that begins to interest us from modern conditions. The creation in Europe of great centralized powers. They fought their wars, they had their great disputes, and except, alas, for the wars of religion, which left such a terrible trace over Central Europe, on the whole, those wars were wars of armies rather than of peoples. And happily, the weapons which they were armed were only destructive to themselves. As we move on into perhaps the century in which most of us think of, particularly I do, as the highest point of Western civilization, it is the 19th century, when the last effort to dominate Europe by a single power, that of Napoleon, had been defeated. Many efforts had been made before, by the Spanish, by the Habsburgs, and by others. But the most dangerous, the most successful, with its combination of Jacobinism and militarism, was finally defeated. And from the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, up to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, there was, throughout the world, a relatively stable system. Let us talk politically. The great powers ruled the world with their mixture of curiosity, desire for gain and authority. They traveled far beyond the confines of Europe. They'd set up empires in the East, British in India, the French in Indochina, and the great colonial systems were under the authority of the great European powers. But the great European powers ruled the world. And although there were disputes and occasional wars, which perhaps the Crimean was the most foolish, but of no great importance except to set some term to the imperialist expansion of Russia, did very little to break up the steady growth of civilized life throughout that century. Take one single example on the economic side. The price level in Britain remained absolutely stable between 1840 and 1900. On the political side, therefore, the great powers ruled the world, either through their enormous influence if they worked together, or through their authority over the parts of the world which were being discovered and then colonized and then taken over. The trader, the missionary, and the administrator. It was a world in which the European exercised, by the mere fact of his being European, enormous authority wherever he went. He set up stations, trading stations, all over the place, without anybody's leave very much. And he was the boss. And that system remained, that political system, until for 100 years. I can remember the last physical and material appearance of it. Queen Victoria's second Jubilee in 1897. I was a child of 3, but I remember it very well. A great procession led by the troops of what were then called the colonies, Australia, New Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and then detachments from every part of the world, some of them just discovered, Africa, Asia, and then the British regiments. And then at the end, a little tiny lady in a little open carriage in black, with her black bonnet, to whom the whole of this vast organization owed fealty, and who played the role as summit of it all. And then, very soon, it ended. When I was a boy, this sense of security, which was in every class, was still strong. It could never change. Just as the dinosaur in these 2 million years no doubt thought he would go on forever, so did we think that everything would go on, more or less as it was. There would be the British Empire, the French, the Russians, the new German Empire, Italy now made into a country from a geographical expression. It would go on. I remember well the summer of 1914. I was an undergraduate. I'd just done one examination with reasonable success and was taking that happy term of leisure, faced with another one 2 years away. I remember packing up my books. I have them still, Herodotus and Plato and the rest, to go for a reading party with some of my friends. But that's not what happened. Suddenly, out of the blue, we went on a nice reading party in a Swiss chalet. We were on the Barrack Square. And suddenly, the whole of this great structure appeared to collapse. The First War, where death, to a frightful extent, swept with his awful scythe through whole ranks of the youth and the middle age of every nation. left something that could never be quite replaced. Yet, so strong was the tradition, so powerful that of world order, of civilized life, that after the war, slowly and with difficulty, but still with remarkable success as a whole, life was reconstructed. Industrial life began again. Social life was resumed. Some countries, very hard hit, began to recover. And I think, with all the faults that were made, some attempt was at any rate made by far-seeing men to create some kind of world order again, to replace that which had been so gravely stricken. But it failed. It failed, if I may say, a personal thought, because of the lack of the power in modern parliamentary and democratic society of the men who had the vision to make their power effective. Briand had it in France, the vision of united Europe. The only two great men whom I have known personally in my life, and by great I mean really great, were Lloyd George and Churchill. The first was destined between the two wars to have no place in power at all. The second was destined to be out of any kind of authority during those 10 vital, tragic years which led inevitably to the Second War. And yet this itself was brought about largely by economic difficulties which might have been controlled. It was the American collapse, the large unemployment, its effect upon Germany, where the combination of an attempt to get reparations, although never effective, created the vast inflation and the great unemployment, and led therefore to the possibility of a demagogue of enormous genius in the shape of Hitler to create the fresh, the new instrument to destroy the balance of the world. The Second War, unlike the first, didn't come like a bolt from the blue. We knew it was coming. Everyone knew, really. And when it came, it was almost relief. But the Second War, lasting so long, covering the whole world, had its effects, which put us today into one of these crises of civilization, in which it is still in the balance, in my view, as to whether we can recover ourselves or whether we shall bend and ultimately collapse under the pressures. For the first period, we didn't do badly. We tried hard. The creation of the United Nations, above all the creation of its most valuable instruments, those for the social and educational work, the Bretton Woods system, and all these other, GATT itself, attempt to create a maximum of trade throughout the world without undue restriction. All these were moving forward. And I would have said, until 20 or 25 years ago, much as they harassed us, they didn't overwhelm us. But of course, the great division, the period when the old European civilization came to an end in its full sense, was not some economic trouble. It was the breakdown of the conference at Potsdam in 1947 and the division of Europe and of the world as a result into two warring groups. The communists and what we like to call ourselves the free world. So long as that division remains, it will be impossible to restore the power of the old European countries. Now, so frightened are each group of the other, they dare not exercise their power. This, together with the breakup of the empires, which resulted partly from the First War and the President Wilson's doctrines, has, as it were, balkanized the world. Every little power thinks itself at liberty to attack its neighbor, to enforce some claim, and almost perpetual warfare going on somewhere or other, which in the old days the great powers would have suppressed. But how can they dare move? Because each is so frightened. If one moves, the other will move against it. And so they've had to create their kind of clientele. Russia very successfully. We not altogether unsuccessfully. But the old concept of a civilization that was single and unique has gone. I therefore think personally that this is one of the greatest events. And so long as it continues, it will dominate all our thinking and all our problems. To pass for a moment, it's true that the military reaction on the part of Western Europe, of the Western world, in which I include the United States because it is really part of the Western tradition, was rapid. And the creation of NATO was an attempt to set up, on the military side at any rate, some kind of barrier. But on the other side, the Western world has not made the progress that, when I was young, we dreamed of. United Europe has not been what we meant it to be. One of the tragedies of history was that Churchill was almost the founder of the European thought, was unable in his second administration to put England into the position of taking the lead, when we could have molded and created the machinery of Europe as one of its founders. It was held back, partly by old age and weakness, partly by the opposition of nearly all his colleagues, and I'm bound to say, of all what is called expert opinion, the Foreign Office, the Treasury, Board of Trade, the Bank of England, the whole establishment. Well, as a result of a very long life, I've come to the conclusion that when all the establishment are united, they're always wrong. The tragedy is, therefore, that Europe has not come into being. It's a society which has useful purposes, but it has not become what we dreamed it to be, a confederation of the civilized powers of Europe that remain, with a single military policy, a single foreign policy, and a single monetary policy. That would have been a real counterbalance to the powers with which we were faced. And that has not happened. So on the political side, I still think that unless we can reach some kind of method of living side by side with communism, And it may be that it's it is within our grasp. I got somewhere towards it in the late 50s and the early 60s, when the concept of Khrushchev himself and the phrases used suggested that we might reach some kind of stabilized situation. Peaceful coexistence was, I think, the phrase was given to it. But it broke down in a series of tragic events. It ought to be revived. But it cannot be revived unless we on our side are equally powerful politically, until Europe has been made into the organization of which we dreamt, not necessarily a federal system, but a confederation, which will be united upon the only things that matter: military policy, foreign policy, and monetary policy. Instead, we have drifted on, and not so badly. But the warnings began. I'm, of course, old-fashioned in this, but I still feel that a capitalist society, the buck must stop somewhere. In other words, there should be some form of money which is exchangeable and fixed in value. For nearly 200 years, Britain provided this. The sterling area, in which more than half the world traded, was an enormous advantage, not merely to Britain, but to the world. Everyone knew that there was, in the final resort, whatever might be the fluctuation of prices or even of currencies in different countries, there was the final price in which quotations could be made and in which debts must be met. It came to an end in 1964. It passed then to the United States. In 1971, in a very few years, President Nixon made the dollar no longer convertible. And so began the chaos of fluctuations of currencies, of prices, continual difficulties for all traders and manufacturers. Of course, they can and do buy forward and sell forward to cover themselves. They can take out insurances, but all these add to the cost of production. They all add to the price which the consumer actually finally pays. But then came the blow from which we are still reeling and which we still do not, I think, wholly understand. There are sudden and enormous rise in the price of oil, not 5, 10, 15%, but a vast rise. Put the Western world and the oil-using countries into an enormous difficulty. In the 19th century, at least, our predecessors, whether by chance or by good fortune, built their industrial society upon a commodity which they controlled, coal. Britain had the coal, France had the coal, Germany had the coal. The whole basis of 19th century development was upon a commodity within the actual control of those who wish to use it. Now, it has passed to some of the oil-producing states who are under no particular influence, now that ours is withdrawn, who are wooed in turn by Russia and the free world, who can play one off against the other. And we had this enormous rise in the cost of manufacture, which had two immediate effects. First, the biggest blow to the undeveloped world. that could be thought of. For what we call the poor, undeveloped world cannot be saved by occasional doles or loans or gifts, however generous. They depend upon the prosperity of the developed world. The poor countries depend upon the wealth of the rich countries. For what do they sell them? They sell the minerals. They sell them all kinds of commodities. And it is the price of copper that matters much more to Zambia than some dole we may make of a few million pounds for some purpose. Similarly, the price of cocoa in New York makes much more difference to the prosperity and future of Ghana than anything we can give them by way of aid. Therefore, the first effect was not only the beginning of what is called the Depression in the developed world, but a terrible blow to the undeveloped world, because everything they had to sell became less easy to sell and brought them less money. The third effect, which I now approaching more dangerous ground, is I still think not quite understood. The third effect was that vast amount of money paid by the oil-using states in terms of money were transferred, but not invested, or not necessarily invested, to the Western banks. Huge sums of money lent on short term and just weighing down the system. For some curious reason, although there are only about 3 financial centers in Europe that could take this money, we set up a great rivalry to attract it and pushed up interest rates for the purpose of getting it, at great trouble and difficulty to ourselves. I will let that pass. Lord Keynes, I remember saying once that, or writing, that the cause of the Depression is nearly always simple. If the rate of saving, he wrote, is not equaled by the rate of investment, then there is bound to be depression. In other words, if money is taken out and just kept useless, hanging, and not reinvested in realities, not put into ships, harbors, railways, schools, draining of desert lands and all the rest, if it just sits there, there is bound to be a continual depression. Now, for some reason or other, there's crept into economics a curious imitation of what we hear daily on the television, the weatherman's news. We are told, oh, well, there's a depression coming from the Atlantic. It will be followed in a week or two by high pressure, and then we shall all be fine. Everybody will be able to go and play golf again. It'll be all right. It's a kind of automatic process of nature. Now we are told if we can tighten our belts and keep quiet, the depression will somehow pass away. How? Nobody knows. And even these changes of nature have a reason, a cause. We're back in the age of the witch doctors, who tried to make the weather change by making the right kind of speeches to their constituents. But it is not so. And so long as this mystique which we've inherited goes on, we shall be no nearer our purpose. There will be changes of policy, of method. Some governments will throw, and this government has been on the whole very generous in spite of its so-called monetary policy, quite large sums of money into the revival of industry, both public and private. Other governments propose still larger sums, 4,000 or 5,000 billions, others 20 billions. But my prophecy is that if this were done, it would have very little effect upon the employment of those for the unemployed who earn their living in productive industry. It would be quite easy, of course, to re-engage a very large number of teachers and even dons. It would be quite easy to expand the civil service, to expand the local service, and so cause unemployment. But the result would be the same, since they will not be creating wealth, but using wealth. Inflation, rise of wages, the great growth of imports, great demand for return to protection, though of what countries we don't quite know. And we will go no nearer the end. And yet, what is the time?
Just 8 o'clock.
And yet, I do not like to leave you without just another, on a note that seems rather sad, and there's another vision. In the 15 or 18 or 20 civilizations, or whatever they may be, which Professor Toynbee has described, and in our own, which has lasted now, let us say, for 2,000 years or more, they've all, in fact, been based on slavery. All the ancient civilizations, all the great pyramids, all the vast buildings which we discover were built by slaves. The Greek was a slave system. We're shown, of course, the beauties of the Parthenon. We're not shown the silver mines at Sorium, where the slaves earned the money that made it possible. They were built on slavery. Middle Ages, the serf system was almost a slave system. And I would say that the enormous power that was in the hands of wealth, whether of any kind, amounted to something of the sort. And even in the first Industrial Revolution, where the great economists of the day, the names who for some strange reason are coming back into fashion, Mill and Cobden and all the rest of them, said that you couldn't run England successfully unless children would work 12 hours in the factories and 10 hours underground. It was a slave system to some extent. Now, for the first time in man's history, in this short, tiny period, 10 or 12,000 years, we call anything like civilized life, compared to the eons and eons of his life of some kind on the earth. For the first time, modern science, applied science, modern technology have put into his hands a weapon which, if properly used, could alter the whole character of daily life. We all know it. We all shrink from it. What would happen if a government came in and said it would build lots and lots of new factories for this and this particular trade? How would they build them? As they now are? No. They would build modern factories, which would employ probably less than a quarter of the number of people that the old systems employed. It is the slaves, the machines, that we must make our slaves. Now, this is an enormous change in attitude of mind, and yet we know it's coming. If it doesn't come in Western world, it'll come using Western technology, but still it will come from the Eastern world. It will come from Korea and Japan, and perhaps from China. Either we've got to recognize that you can build as high a pyramid as you like, as it were upside down, resting on a very small base, with universities and schools and medicine, all the luxuries of civilization, leisure. But there must be a wealth-producing base to justify it. The question is, must that be the old one that we've inherited, or the new one that lies within our grasp? Anyone who has seen the results of modern computer-controlled and the robot and the rest of it realizes what is bound to happen. But we don't talk about it. It's not thought good for taste. We're talking about the old system. Throw more money into the system, it would automatically rise. It won't. Change the system with all that's involved, which means, of course, the combination of every person involved. The trade unions, the labor, the managers, the owners, into a world which it may take 25, may take 50 years to develop, will be as different as the world in the second great industrial revolution as was the last century from the world of the dinosaurs. This is what lies before us. If I were 18, not 88, I wouldn't be depressed. I wouldn't think the game's up. I wouldn't read or write the nostalgic stories about how jolly the past was. It's a marvelous, wonderful picture that opens it up. The organization of Europe, vital. The close combination with the United States in a new system, vital. The cooperation, if possible, some kind of détente with communist society, every effort to be made. But above all, the creation of a society in which leisure, not merely as it used to be when I was a boy, leisure for the rich, but leisure for everyone. Oh, say some of my friends, but won't it be very bad for them? What do they do? What do they do with all their leisure? And I'm bound to say they're brought up in a rather old-fashioned way. I feel that sometimes. I also sometimes look at my interrogator and said, well, what have you done with your leisure? Play bridge a bit and drink a bit and walk down Pall Mall, enjoy your dividends? No. It isn't leisure. It's a different kind of occupation. And look what is open to us. Not merely of the mind, the universities, the teaching, the study that could be developed, but of the body. The Japanese have made an attempt to solve it by all of them playing golf. Well, we perhaps will all play golf. But there are plenty of other occupations for mankind in the countryside, in the garden, in all the most rewarding of efforts. How to organize it, how to decide whether to be lots of short shifts or some, how to divide up the labor, and all that is going to be an immense problem, but we must do it. And if I say I was a young man, I don't think I would take I'm sorry to see some people tend to do a rather nostalgic and backward-looking view. I would rather say, well, we're in one of those crises of civilization, which if it faces, it can create a great new period of wealth and strength. If it shrinks from it, it will gradually decay and become out of date. And some other peoples, perhaps whose civilizations have been long stagnant, will rise and take our place. That is the choice that lies before the youth and the middle age, the governing classes of every nation. But before they make it, they must face the truth and not content themselves with just repeating the old slogans that we learnt and repeated over and over again 30 or 40 years ago.
Care to leave now?
Where do we go? Can't we go where now?
We've got your wires off. Now we have your wires off, we can take you through straight away.
Have you got what you want with
Yes.
it?
We have.
Well, what do
If you
you,
leave that, sir, I'll come with you with it.
why do I want this?
Well, that
Ready to go?
In your own time, please, Alistair.
If you're ready.
I think we better end up on the subject, which is civilization.
Oh,
may
sure.
crack
Oh, don't worry.
and fall,
We will.
or they may recover.
We will have that.
Quite a good example, actually, Egypt, which was for 4,000 years, of which 1,500 years, remember, was occupied by the Hicksite. These very strange people came and broke the whole thing down. Then they drove them out and started again.
Your Ichthyosaurus.
Huh?
Your Ichthyosaurus.
Yes. They're people called Hicksite. Nobody quite knows where they are.
No.
No, it's very much disputed. But they certainly broke down the great, practically immovable Egyptian system, which lasted about 3,000 years.
You spoke today about the 1930s and about the present recession. How do the two compare?
Well, I think they are different both in character, size, and origin. The first depression, of course, was partly the result, began with us in 1929, of the manufacturing countries having raised their wages and their costs too high for the countries that wanted to buy them. And the purchasing power wasn't quite sufficient. But then that spread from the wild and really mad speculation in the United States, where every messenger boy was buying shares and everybody was gone quite wild. Something much more like that we've never had since the South Sea bubble, which of course collapsed. And with it, when it collapsed, it went much further than it need have gone. And they then had to try to make some recovery from it. But so powerful is the economy of the United States upon the rest of the world that it had an effect upon us all. There was then a great argument, same as there is now, what was the best thing to do? The national government was formed on the basis of economy, cutting expenditure. And on the whole, a great deal of it was right. It annoyed a lot of people, but it had some advantages. But it hadn't very much of a constructive program. And its difficulty was that the only one who had a constructive program was Lloyd George, who in his pamphlet, which was written largely by some of the leading economists who he got around him, he did at least put up some plan of creating a new substructure. For instance, all the roads, which we now call the M's, he wanted to build them. They would have given employment. But the difficulty of it was that it wasn't really solved. It solved itself, because by 1955 and 56, and 35 and 36, we'd moved into the period of rearmament. And it was a curious paradox. It was Hitler who solved the unemployment problem.
Now, you had a plan in the 1930s, the middle way.
Yes.
Would you say that the lessons of that time could be applied to today?
No, because I think the underlying reasons are quite different. Here, well, to some extent different. In my little address, I failed to say that one of the ill results of the oil thing, which is really the fundamental cause of it, is not only that the money of the Arab states is not invested, it's just held on short term. And therefore, the rate of saving, by which he meant the rate at which money is taken out, isn't equal by the rate at which it goes in, is still operating and will continue to operate. The only way you could do out of that would be to try and form some great world bank, try and lend, make their money to them, and set about doing all the things in the world which need to be done. Because remember, the world is not merely partly unexplored, it's partly gone back. North America, North Africa, the Sahara, was once the Middle West of Europe. All Italy, all Rome lived on the wheat, and you can still see around the little Roman cities. But it was destroyed. It could be restored. The whole area of the Mesopotamia, if you fly over it, you can still see the canals. It was all the greatest wheat-growing country in the world. It could be restored. And if the capital wasn't just moved about and occasionally a little money spent on a casino or buying a hotel, that's nothing compared to the total. If it could be organized through some world system, that it was spent in capital goods and in real development, then the rate of investment would equal, and indeed perhaps even greater than too much we might have. But still, that would stop the fundamental reason. Until that stopped, the depression will not, as I say, like a thing, go away. It didn't go away before. Hitler drove it away before. And this time, only the combined efforts that I tried to suggest, political and economic, can put it away.
But do you really believe in the shape of the world at the moment, that something like that is practical?
But if it were, I don't know. I'm not a prophet or professor, but I think if it isn't done, this civilization, like many others, after all there have been about 20, may easily collapse and leave very little trace. It doesn't mean that it won't leave some trace, because it's spread much further than any previous civilization. Most of them are confined to their area, the valley of the Nile, or the cities in Guatemala, or the Sumeria, or somewhere. It's going to spread to the world, but the world will take it up. And what I ended by saying, the modern methods of producing wealth. It's quite easy to spend wealth. The important thing is to produce it. Put it in a single word. The history of civilization is like a pyramid. When it begins, it has a very narrow top and a very broad base. At the top, there's perhaps a king, a couple of witch doctors, 2 or 3 civil servants, and that's all. At the base, everybody is producing wealth. They're plowing the fields, or looking after the cattle, or the sheep. They're all wealth producers. As it develops, it turns into a pillar. More and more effort is spent in on things which don't reach the market, on monarchies, on churches, on universities, on philosophy, on writing, on art, on everything that makes civilization. But it's supported by the base. Now what's happened is that the base has got very narrow. If you take in the total working class, working population of Britain, how many are producing wealth? Many are employed in civil service, in hospital, all sorts of things. But the actual thing on which it all rests is the production of wealth. All I'm saying is that instead of trying to cling to old-fashioned methods of producing wealth, we should seize the sudden opportunity that's come to us from applied science and use the machine to produce wealth, the machine itself.
You suggested that there might still be witch doctors about, running the economy.
No, I mean, these are very difficult concepts, but you can't stand away from them. It's exactly like, do you ever read Bronte, that wonderful book, Shirley, Bronte? I suppose about, well, ever since man existed, cotton had been produced by the spinning wheel in every village. When Odysseus got back to Ithaca, he found his wife spinning cotton. And they were spinning it up to 1830. In the same way, every woman had a wheel, and they invented the spinning jenny. And the whole system was destroyed. But of course there were riots, of course there was trouble, because suddenly the whole of this employment disappeared. Taking power, when Stephenson invented steam, whole vast mass of power-producing things were put out of work. But if civilization is to move on, it's got to face that and deal with it. Now, I don't think we did deal with it in a very humane way in the 20th century. That's its weakness. But we've got to deal with it. Because if it doesn't, it'll be... We're not the most intelligent people in the world, as all that. There are plenty of other intelligent people in China, in the whole of the East, everywhere, who can do these things just as well. And so we've either got to be static, which means you go back. And it's exactly like everything in life. You either go up or you go down. If you want a moving staircase, you've got to go up. It's no good trying to go down on it. And this is the choice. It may well be that it will break. And it will be written about by archaeologists in 3,000 or 4,000 years' time as quite interesting result of the breakup of the civilization, which had really ultimately was based upon Greece and Rome and the church. We got many disadvantages, but we have some advantages. And all I was saying is if I were a young man, I wouldn't be frightened of it. At any rate, I'd work at it.
But now, if you were a young man, if you were 18 and not 88, as you said, do you think Britain can do anything on her own to improve things, to end the recession?
No, nobody can. It's just like Europe. I mean, that was the whole fallacy of those who wanted us not to go into Europe. Look what we've suffered. If we'd gone into the beginning, we could have created it, we could have shaped it, we would have made it into the organization we wanted. No, of course not. How can a country of 60 million people have the... In the 19th century, it had at least great empire. It had the Indian army, it had colonies, it had power. But we haven't power of that kind. We've either got our brain and our goodwill and our tradition. But for the kind of adjustments that would have to be made, if you can imagine a world in which the machines did almost everything, it's fascinating. It's H.G. Wells, but it's coming.
In your day, the leaders of the world met to talk about disarmament and the bomb. Do you think this is a time when they should meet to talk about the economy more often?
Well, there's no point in talking about the bomb, because whether Britain has the bomb or not, America's going to disarm. The only question is whether Britain has some kind of a contribution or none. If she has none, then she becomes a purely client state of America.
But now about the economy. Is it worth the leaders of the world trying to do something about it? When they meet, they don't seem to get anywhere.
Well, yes, but they've got the leaders of the world must do it. If Lloyd George was alive today, do you think he wouldn't be doing something? I mean, it needs people to do these things.
And
America is a country that's very easily swayed by individuals, actually. If FDR were alive, I think he would be doing something. But it seems to me that we've become into a new society, which is, and perhaps when the historian writes it, it may even be the reason that that marvelous city in Guatemala came to an end. It had too many civil servants. See, we become a country when, if you want to do anything, it isn't a chap does it. You say, let's have a committee to do it. Let's have a council to do it. The greatest movement in the history of the world, the only one with any strength left in it, was made by 12 men, under God's grace, by 12 men, of whom one was a traitor.
Thank you.
One was a traitor.
Yes, very good.
What about him?
I think you always know when to have a good end.
Okay, give me a minute.
Thank you very much indeed. I know it's been a
No, I'm proud.